We learned a lot from our different presentations to get at different angles of clusters, of proximity, of the importance of commute, and also about the different initiatives that actually can be used and have been successfully used to harness the potential that SMEs are and that entrepreneurs provide for the local areas. The one thing that I would like to understand a bit more is how is this actually differing across different types of cities? Is the capacity that we have to use the same, or do we need to use different types of actions? We saw the industrial districts that are very much the northern Italian development model. But is this, when we look at the map, we also saw that in the south of Italy, the whole boot did not really show the same kind of activity. Is this something that's really just for the motor industry, or do we struggle to utilize this model and to utilize these capacities that we see in the north, also in other parts of Italy, Andrea?
Thanks for the question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Well, clearly let's say the industrial district model is something that you can apply, in different geographical areas. What makes certainly a difference is the sectoral perspective, because you don't have motor valley all around the country, but you do have spontaneous initiatives and emerging clusters also in what you might want to call peripheral areas or backward areas, but in rather different type of sectors. So, for example, I studied long ago the so-called SOFA Valley. Oh, there are all kinds of valleys, of course, which, of course, builds around different type of skills than the mechanical type of knowledge bases that you find around Bologna and the Motor Valley. And also, to a certain extent, a different organizational model. While Motor Valley, although the big brands, you also have a variety of SMEs and entrepreneurial venture. For example, in the Sofa Valley in the south of Italy, that was built around some major players. So organizational models within industrial district have been different and have been changing over time, I must say. That is something that has been discussed in the literature, and of course, also in terms of policy action requires different type of interventions. Industrial districts have been for many years centered around population of small and medium enterprises. Over time, some of these small and medium enterprises became leaders within their own territory, and moving from an organization which was more or less homogeneous to a sort of hub-and-spoke system in which micro firms or small firms were very much dependent on the hub, the leader firm, which, of course, that brings back to one of the questions of this session, to what extent then this system is resilient over time. I mean, to what extent firms get anchored to the system. While changing, let's say some of the firms might become even more footloose, and leaders might leave.
At the same time, when we looked at your analysis, one of the points you highlighted was that not every place was equally successful in creating those motorcycle industries. And the example you gave was that there might be an incumbent who's actually kind of crowding out the opportunities for new firms to kind of emerge, which actually opens up opportunities for other places that weren't leading beforehand. So the Motor Valley was not always the Motor Valley, but became the Motor Valley, maybe also because it overcame the constraint that was set in other places. Is this something that is a growth and a development model that you can see in other places? And a follow-up on this one, while you think about it, we're talking about valleys here. So this, again, refers to the space and the amount of place that's being taken up by these clusters, by the firm linkages, and that creates a place that's conducive for the growth of firms. But how far does this actually extend? How big does a valley need to be? Can it be a very small local area, or is it really a whole region? Is it a province? Where is the most important agglomeration and the clustering of firms occurring?
Well, the first question is, okay, can we find a sort of a competition between places? I mean, you say, okay, in one place, the example that I show, Turin area, there was a crowding, possibly a crowding out effect, and Motor Valley, because of that, could emerge as an important player into this sector. Certainly, you can reason from this perspective. I mean, competition between different places in order to attract talents, for example. In that specific context, I think there were also a number of preconditions that might link back also to the presentation of David Aldrich. I mean, you might look at certain kind of historical antecedents, can be culture. I mean, I stress a lot this idea of civicness and cultural collaboration, which was particularly important in that specific context, contrasting possibly with other areas where there was much more conflict between, for example, working class and local entrepreneurs of big firms. So I'm not sure whether the crowding act itself open up opportunities for different places if these different places don't have those kind of precondition. In terms of okay, so the second question goes back perhaps to something that we've been discussed also in the morning. What would be the optimal size? What would be the critical mass that you need in order to build up a successful industrial district? I mean, it's hard to give a question. Of course, over time, with the opening up of markets and the global integration of industrial district into a global value chain, to a certain extent, you might expect the threshold or the critical mass should be increasing. And possibly, that explains why not all these districts were able to compete internationally. The recent crisis that affected, well, Italy as many other European countries, affected also industrial district quite heavily. And not all of them were resilient. And this goes back to your question. Some of them didn't have possibly the critical mass. This might also question whether a population of only SMEs can really, in a context of hyper-globalization, can really resist to such shocks, and whether there you need to have a central player, or a few central players, or stronger support from well, public investment bank or the like.
Very good. Sticking a bit with the question about the scale part, Darja, you mentioned the point that, or you made the point that in the center of the city, the homework capacity of small business owners is much higher. One of the points I was wondering about is this what attracted these people to the area in the first place? Or is it that there are more opportunities being created in a central city because it is more accessible, more walkable? We saw the example of Los Angeles earlier in the morning. It was mentioned also during the discussions, where you have a very dense ethnic community that allows access to commercial space very easily. Whereas when we look at the suburbs of Paris, where you have the segregation of different communities, is it this part that kind of people were there, and because they were there, it created an opportunity for them? Or do we need to have opportunities for people to move into areas that are extremely useful for them to start successful businesses?
With the data, I cannot answer a question on the direction of causality. However, I mean, what we can see is that small business owners have a quite a high prevalence of working and living in the central city, but there are also these hidden businesses in homes that because of the residential structure of cities are more suburban, and we can see this in other research as well. So interestingly, so they are quite spread over the city, and therefore can also fulfill quite different functions for the city. In answer to your question, because of in the inner city, I mean, we have a variety of premises available usually. So therefore, these small business owners are also attracted to these places. Interestingly, why they also then live so close, that is another question. So whether they maybe also have a preference to live in the inner city, or whether being in business owners, because of time budget, makes it necessary to live so close. I mean, the fact is, and I could see this in other research as well, that small business owners and the self-employed have these very close proximity, so they have a greater choice in relation to their workplace location. Unfortunately, I cannot say this about their residential location. I mean, so generally. So, but of course, in the city, or if a city provides this variety of business premises, then we could also expect this that this distribution then of small business owners, and not only their workplaces but also where they live, which then can really increase this diversity and the variety that is so important for economic activity in the city, a la Jane Jacobs. So we could think of all sorts of interesting conclusions, which I cannot now provide really robust analysis, but I can see really the big potential of that, and that this must be part of the diversity that has been really spoken about of cities for decades.
I think diversity can create great benefits, and it makes also the job of a policymaker a bit more difficult. And someone who knows about diversity is hopefully Roberta, given the wide variety of companies that are kind of part of your membership. And what I was very impressed with the roadshow you put into place and the lessons you drew from it is the different varieties of engagement that come out of this one. So from your work on this project, what is kind of the key lessons for policymakers if they try to engage with their local businesses, if they actually want to have functioning partnerships between the private sector and the public sector to make the best out of empty spaces, for example, where we saw some of the best practices in your case? What is it that policymakers need to do to actually engage with their local companies?
So this for policymaker roles. We try to do this with our experience to reduce this gap that we have to say there is between policymakers and the people who work in the city. So, and in this case, we were, as national association, we were not actors, but we were a sort of art director, but the actor were in the city. And we saw that policymakers are really interesting in finding solution now. I think this is the only good aspect of the crisis. They don't have resources anymore. And they can't do alone everything as before, deciding top-down what was the best solution for the city. Now they need to work together with other subjects in the cities. And this is also more creative and maybe helps to find the best solution. For instance, when we visited the first city, because we started with an experimental project of this workshop in the previous years, and then so we were visiting one city after the other. And what we have been saying to our entrepreneurs is to look at the program of your administration. There is an annual program with money, of course, put to pay some actions. And look at the things that you can agree with the administration. Don't start from the opposite side as before. We are asking for this and that. No, there is one project, one action, one line that the administration has to conclude in 5 years. And so sit together with your administration and try to concretely act in the same direction. And so this is from our part. And on the other side, administrators, they cannot write a program without listen to the people that in the city works. So the key word, in my opinion, is to be modest. As urban planner, as policymaker, to be modest and to listen to the others in a very equal situation.
And when you say it's important to listen, do you see a difference in what you can listen to when it comes to firms that are run by entrepreneurs themselves, maybe family-owned businesses, as opposed to other types of companies where you interact with the managers of the local office? Is this a different type of engagement? Are there different visions and views?
Too fast.
Sorry, let me slow down. I was also asked to slow down for the interpreters. I apologize. Do you see there is a difference in the kind of communication, the engagement you have with enterprise owners, with the entrepreneurs themselves, maybe family-owned businesses, as opposed to managers of subsidiaries of larger firms that would be in a place, people that work in chain companies, something like this? Is there a different quality of interaction, especially when it comes to a vision for a local area?
A vision point?
For the local place, for the area.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. There are many differences. And this is why it's also a social work. I mean, there are many interests on the city, you know, and so big firms, okay, they have more power to dialogue with the administration. And that's why I think it's important that also family owners, they work together. We saw in our experience that cities are understanding and the value to create, for instance, commercial districts, to act all together, even if they are small, even if it's small shops or that have to deal with the daily problem and to survive in the city where franchising can arrive and buy everything. So what about if there is a group of retailers that together are playing the same play? And this creates good projects, and if this is following a vision, it's important that even if it's a small city, there is a vision, and this vision is shared amongst groups of retailers or also administrators and policymakers.
Very good. Alexandra, this difference between, entrepreneurs, owner, operators, as opposed to other kind of companies, Do you think there's something that also creates different types of externalities that these types of firms have on the local areas?
I do think so, actually. We did some research for the United States, and we were looking at employment effects of self-employment versus wage and salary employment. So we wanted to see if, we called it multipliers, but pretty much if allocation, we were looking at counties, those are smaller units, if increasing number of self-employed leads to greater employment growth in the same area. And we compared it to identical effects or comparable effects from wage and salary employment. So we actually saw way larger effects from self-employment, and it came as a surprise because despite the fact that US culture is really business-oriented, and they talk a lot about self-employment and how business creation is important, usually self-employment comes as like second thought, pretty much, just because they are so small. So we saw in terms of spillovers, or how many new jobs per one self-employed job is created, we saw the magnitude of 3 times larger than spillovers from wage and salary employment in urban counties. The effect in rural counties was way smaller, so self-employment has greater role in stimulating economic growth in urban areas, probably because they are able to employ more people, but also by providing employment opportunities and spending effects and input-output linkages, which are definitely vibrant, more vibrant in cities. So I definitely believe that self-employment is important. So that's, I guess, the answer.
Picking up the line that we had in the morning where it's also about ownership and who runs it and who takes decisions. Okay, I think I talked a lot. With that, if there are questions from the audience, please.
Hi, my name is Milford Bateman from University of Pula in Croatia. I'm very fascinated by the issue of the motor vehicle, the motorbike industry in northern Italy. I mean, the northern Italy model is based, particularly in Emilia-Romagna, on very competent and proactive local governments. And I wonder if you'd give us a comment on, Andrea, on that issue. Was it because the success in Emilia-Romagna was because this was another example of them proactively, constructively intervening in a sort of a developmental state type of capacity to do things, whereas maybe Bologna and Torino pulled back from that type of activity? They're not really known as much as Emilia-Romagna is maybe for that. I don't know whether that would be the case.
Thank you for the question. I would, I'm not sure what you mean for proactive development intervention, because I would actually argue that public intervention, at least the state level, was very little in Emilia-Romagna. And according to the literature, this is one of the reasons you have this entrepreneurial culture. So the state was hands-off on these regions, and there is only one sector, at least between after Second World War till the early 80s, in which the state intervened, which was the petrochemical. But apart from that, which was in the eastern part of the region, apart from that, the region is characterized by many of these either specialized districts or small and medium enterprises, while actually state intervention was much stronger in other regions, including Lombardy regions. And these other regions were part of the so-called industrial triangle in Italy that would link Milan, Turin, and Genoa, where you had heavy industries and big capitals and also big capitalistic families. So although I'm not particularly, I don't like particularly the idea of the crowding out that was discussed also this morning, possibly the more freedom that local government had, because the central government would not look at Emilia-Romagna, would not help Emilia-Romagna that much, at least talking at that period till the early 80s, also because of political reasons. I mean, this was the red belt in Italy, that in a way much more freedom. And this freedom with some of the ingredients that I've been mentioning before, listening, but vision at the same time, help them to gather consensus. And this, I mean, was, sociologists say, was built also on some historical antecedents. I mean, this was the place where there was sharecropping, a proto-industrial type of entrepreneurial intervention, where the socialist idea spread out and create this communalism. So let's say this civicness and the workers and entrepreneurs were used to share more or less same values, and this ethic of work helped also government, local government, so I'm talking about really local government, to gather consensus and build this broad coalition, which to a certain extent had conflicting interests, but they were very much flexible in trying to find solutions together. So, for example, trade unions were particularly strong in Emilia-Romagna, as you can imagine, but much less conflictual than in other regions. And that helped to build a common vision. That especially is between, let's say, the 50s and late 70s. The example that I was showing, it's signaling the fact that to a certain extent, despite globalization, despite, let's say, political leadership in that region has changed over time, there are still signs of this culture of collaboration that helps the different districts, including the Motor Valley, to renew themselves and face also the different challenges that emerge. But it's not developmental state as such. So it's not that model.
Very good.
That would be my view of my reading of the literature, I would say. But we can discuss it later on. I mean, but I mean, if you have a follow-up, I'm open to.
Peter Nijkamp.
Peter Nijkamp, the Netherlands. I wish to thank the panel speakers for a wealth of information. I learned a lot so far. I have two simple questions maybe for all of the panel members. First, statistically, most of the SMEs are found in urban areas. And if you correct for farmers, by far most SMEs are living and are found in urban areas. Brings me to the first question. Is this because of the indigenous urban attractiveness, where cities would provide important seedbed conditions, creativity conditions for favoring SMEs? Or are SMEs just found in bigger urban areas because that's where the market is? And that leads to completely different policy conclusions. A second simple question as well. We may have nostalgic feelings about beautiful SMEs as being a rich ecosystem in a city, etc. Fantastic positive views, and the panel has given very nice examples. But mind you, in many countries, almost 50%, and sometimes even more than 50% of all SMEs, certainly the new starters, has disappeared after 5 years. So the survival rate is not so high. And I would like to ask the panel members, what are the collapse factors for SMEs? Is this, again, economic general conditions, financial conditions, marketing conditions, and what have you? Or are there weak urban environments, and that's where the urban fabric can be important, are there weak urban environments and urban fabrics which lead to a collapse or a higher than average collapse of SMEs?
Very good. Two important and challenging questions. I think we can take them in turn, starting with the first one that asks us about why cities. Any volunteers? Otherwise, okay. Andrea.
Yeah, no, I mean, starting also from the example that I gave, because I dig into the data and I've read also the biographies of the founders. Certainly, for the sector that I've been investigating, especially at the very early stages of the emergence of that sector, demand conditions were important. So this was a period in which workers would need mobility, and many of the workshops, not really small workshop of motorcycle producers, and before them bicycles producers, were just next to demand. In some cases, they were the users themselves. Well, that's a very specific case, like the pilots or the army officers, or were enthusiastic users, let's put it like that. So demand condition would be particularly important, rather than, let's say, you mentioned skills or other inputs. About the second questions, well, to a certain extent, yeah, I mean, despite the fact that I find survival rates particularly high for entrepreneurs, certainly regularities and statistics tells that these small firms tend to fail. Possibly, I would be kind of provocative myself in the answer, saying that, yeah, that's true that many fails, but the positive entrepreneurial entry and exit dynamics might lead those that survive to important innovations. So in the end, you might say many fails, but let's say that's not the big problem. Because if we don't observe the failure rate, we would not observe any industry dynamics. So the one that survive might bring innovation that are important, and they might lead to the emergence of the market. So we do want to observe even failure. So that would not be a problem in itself.
Darja.
Regarding the first question, I cannot address the second one. For a lot of startups, the earlier employment experience is very important, and clearly large employers are concentrated in cities, so this will have an effect, and just because in cities, I mean, just as employment centers, they are more likely to create small and medium-sized businesses through linkages to earlier employment in large firms, for example. Interestingly, for the businesses I have studied, so micro businesses and home-based businesses, we have seen that they have very little so traded interdependencies with the actual place where they are located. So they are more likely than other small and medium-sized businesses to trade nationally and also internationally. So, and with respect to untraded interdependencies, again, we could find gender effects that, particularly for women-led micro businesses, they tend to have more of untraded interdependencies that were quite local, but we couldn't find this for men-led micro businesses. So it's the answer is not so straightforward.
It's a bit of both. Alexandra.
Yeah, I want actually to pick up on Darja's answer and actually thank Peter for wonderful questions, which are very tricky, to be honest, because he really poses them as like clear-cut, this or this. In reality, it's not, of course. So the right answer is always, it depends. It's always a mix of different factors, and then what specifically kind of is more important in this mix depends on a specific context. And then here, so far, we were talking about cities, and we were talking about SMEs, but they are extremely heterogeneous, both SMEs and cities. So the right answer to the question, I guess, everything depends, but it depends on the cities, their size, their industrial composition, their productivity level, their innovation level, you name it. The same actually applies to SMEs because they are extremely different in terms of sizes. We are going from 1 to 249. They belong to different industries. They take different technologies. They utilize different levels of innovations in their production processes. So coming back to mostly urban areas and why SMEs are in mostly urban areas. I think at least in the United States example, a lot depends on many things, but I wanted to highlight the prevalent or historical industrial structure. I'm talking about now classical study by Chinitz from 1969, I think, where he compares New York and Pittsburgh, and he tries to understand why New York is so much more entrepreneurial. And to measure entrepreneurship, we usually look at smaller companies to see how prevalent they are, compared to Pittsburgh, where entrepreneurship is pretty low. And he actually comes to a conclusion that it is historically, Pittsburgh was located next to ore mines. So this determined the industrial structure of the city, which was dominated by large companies. Large companies do not really promote entrepreneurship and small business formation, because first they draw resources, but also over time they are unable to build this entrepreneurial culture. So there is no exposure or less exposure to entrepreneurial spirit in such cities. So eventually over time we build this lack of entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial capacity. Whereas in New York, it's completely different. They were building from these small shops. New York still prohibits Walmart to come and sell in the city. And the point is to protect small businesses. So that's kind of, I wanted to highlight the importance of industrial structure and historical heritage in entrepreneurship levels. For the survival, I'm not sure how, in my research, I looked at how actually the question boils down how regional environment determines survival of businesses. We did research, again, on the United States. We were looking how innovative environment of a metropolitan area determines or affects survival of companies in computer and electronic product manufacturing industry, which is considered to be one of the most innovative in the country. So our expectation actually was that being located in more entrepreneurial metropolitan areas would help companies to survive. We actually were finding really strong and consistent negative effects. So at least some parts of the urban fabric, if we can consider innovation a part of urban fabric, so we can see both probably negative and positive effect, but for innovation, it was a negative effect. Thank you.
Very good. Roberta.
Yeah, may I add something? On the two tricky questions, I have to say that PME are in cities, I'm speaking from, of course, thinking about commerce, but because PME are the city, I mean, the city since the beginning, since ever, are places of commerce, of exchange. That's why enterprises stay there. But of course, it doesn't mean that territories don't have any possibility to develop other business economy. And I also think that innovation will help this process, because territories are full of value and cities are also full of criticity aspects. So I think we will also see a more developed, even if I know that statistics are foreseen that we all are going to live in cities in the future, but I have this hope that to develop a more balanced way, not only a polycentric growth, but inclusive growth, including territories as places full of beauty and potentiality. And this was for the first question. And the second one, of course, the nostalgia of old cities. Is something that I face immediately, join this new project, speaking with entrepreneurs, and of course they say, oh, shops are closing, And you can say, no, don't worry, next year everything will be better. No, you have to accept this, that we are in transition and the world will be different. But be resilient means also be able to use technology. So what we did, why we started with innovation and tradition in Rome. I know that e-commerce was a bad word not to pronounce, but finally, practically experimented the mix that there is in the shop, using technologies and training with new opportunities. So they saw advantages also in innovation, and that's why it's important also to think that we are going in a generation replacement in this direction. So what will be for new, for passing from parents to son, the son is a digitalized people, and he will organize differently his own retail, his own shop. So, of course, change is something that's scaring, but this is the direction, so we can just follow it and find the best solutions.
Very good. Final question from the audience. Otherwise, up. Well, two final questions from the audience.
Mine is a very short question. So I work at OECD. My name is Federica Daniele, and I have a question for Darja, because I think that homework is something that, for now, it's probably very small, I mean, at the aggregate level, but as also Alexandra was saying, it has many great opportunities, especially for a specific part of the population, which is women. So I found your presentation very interesting, and I also thought that there are some con against the rise of home working, which is the fact that people are going to be sharing less ideas if they work from home. Yes, there are social networks that allow us to share ideas, but is distance completely dead? And I'm not just thinking about startups, labs, but I'm also thinking about programs that allow even old entrepreneurs to kind of implement or follow long life training, and this typically takes place in a physical facility, in a shared environment. So are there any ways to combine these two elements? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, I was waiting for this microphone. Yeah, thanks. A very interesting question, and particularly in Italy, so a lot of co-working centers have been built in cities, particularly in cities. So this is one movement, or as a reaction to increase in homeworking, increase in entrepreneurship, and creating spaces where homeworkers or entrepreneurs can work and meet, and not only working in isolation in the home. Interestingly, even though Italy has seen this rise in co-working spaces, so home-based working is rather low in Italy compared to other European countries. So the UK is really an example of quite a high homeworking rate. So overall, but more so actually, even though the Scandinavian countries have a lower self-employment rate than in Southern Europe, their actual homeworking rate amongst the self-employed is much higher. So there's a very interesting geography of co-working and homeworking going on, and particularly from Scandinavia, there is so a trend towards self-organized co-working, so where we can really see, okay, so reactions of cities, for example, to an increase in homeworking could be also to facilitate the self-organized co-working. That's not only inexpensive co-working spaces, and some home workers or entrepreneurs are saying these spaces are too expensive. So I don't know, in Italy, local authorities have really subsidized these co-working spaces, but also subsidized workers to go to them, so to provide, for example, vouchers. So it's quite an exceptional case. So we see very different reactions to these disadvantages of home working, interestingly. Mm-hmm.
Final question.
Good afternoon. My name is Daniele Vettorato. I'm from Italy. I work at Utrecht Research in Bolzano. Just learning from the triple helix framework, I found, let's say, a big absent in the discussion. Of course, it's not the topic of the conference, but just a curiosity. What is, in your opinion, the relationship between urban fabric and the presence of, let's say, universities or big innovation centers, like could be, any university or private research institutions, and the success of SMEs. For example, in Emilia-Romagna, what is the role of the University of Bologna and the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering in supporting, in case, the framework of the motor district, or if you have any other thought about it? Thank you.
Very good. We lost David Aldrich, who could have told us more about the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, which seem to be a fan favorite. Please, the role of universities. And I think you had something at the very end where going forward, the universities are actually going to become more important again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks for the question. Of course, that's perhaps more a way how you frame it. So we didn't give that central stage, and I didn't give that central stage in the presentation to, for example, universities or technological centers or technopoles. But of course, especially for the type of sector and the type of region I was talking about, they are very central. So when I was presenting this idea of an Emilian model and an industrial district are part of that, clearly central actors are technopoles and the like scientific parks. And in the Motor Valley, very recently, there has been this initiative to create the Motor Vehicles University, which is actually a sort of triple helix type of approach in which you have local government, universities, and local companies that gather together and create a joint partnership, which is, I mean, it's something very new. I think you don't find many of those examples. I think for gastronomy, Pollenzo is another example of that. In Piedmont, where you had slow food, also Emilia-Romagna, and then Italy and other organizations that joined together to create a university in a kind of triple helix fashion. So yes, that's certainly a type of model that you can apply in those kind of areas. Thanks.
May I have just something? Of course, I'm sorry I didn't mention it, but in our network of networks, there are, of course, universities, because in each territory we are trying to put together all the potential actors. And also university works with us. For instance, we are working with the Polytechnic of Milan on urban practice. There is a department working on urban planner related to commercial issues. And in my previous life, when I was on the other side in the public sector, I've been also dealing with incubator. And of course, in the incubator, we worked also with for instance, the university and the department for creative enterprises. So just to give support, because it's not enough to put enterprises to give an office, but then you have to work together with them, and university can help, of course.
And to finish on a plug for our own work, the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities has an initiative called Higher Education Innovate, where we actually do hands-on work to try to understand how can universities be the drivers for entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial education and engagement in entrepreneurial activity for the local area. So I think even if it's not really at the forefront of the current debate here, we're very much aware of the issue, but at some point we have to also decide what topics we can highlight.